I think anybody looking at this field would be well served to contemplate these. CDM, that's the only compliant market we know of right now that has forestry outside of RGGI, which has a little bit of restoration in it. But the reason forestry never really took off in CDM is because they only looked at restoration projects, which is either reforestation in degraded areas or afforestation, being large plots of plantations. And the issue, as we'll talk about with restoration work, is that there's a big cost up front. And what CDM couldn't quite figure out is how you actually finance that large cost that you incur up front over a long period of time, because under CDM you can only monetize these projects once they actually sequester the carbon. And as most of you know, when you plant a little seedling, there's not a lot of carbon in there. 100 years from now or 25 years from now, depending on the tree, there's a whole lot more carbon. But financing something that may cost you a couple $1 million today where you can't pay it back till 25 years isn't very productive, and it doesn't motivate a lot of people to do these types of projects. So furthermore, what they ended up doing is actually putting a temporary limit. They call them temporary CERs, which aren't fully fungible beyond a 5-year period. So it really killed the forestry market. That's why we think perhaps red may end up playing a much bigger role in the future because we're not, well, red isn't faced with the same challenges that restoration is within the CDM market right now. So what are the project types? Quite frankly, whether you're talking about voluntary or compliance, these are what we'd be looking at: afforestation, reforestation, which you know is the planting of trees on land that was either degraded or non-forested in order to sequester carbon that would otherwise not have been there at the get-go of the project. So you're planting trees or plantations that will sequester carbon over a period of time. Naturally, planting a eucalyptus tree in say, Africa or New Zealand or Australia or Brazil, if you were to do such a thing, you're going to sequester a lot more carbon in a shorter period of time than if you're planting an oak tree in Ontario. Improved forest management, a very popular one. It's altering a common practice baseline to increase the carbon stocks over a period of time. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the graph I'll show you here in a second. And avoided conversion. Avoided conversion is actually choosing to leave trees standing in lieu of a higher value market alternative for that forested space. In such a case, let's take an example of an area that may be completely cleared for, or 80% cleared for a golf course or residential development or you know, a strip shopping mall. You can see most of that forest being cleared, therefore you're losing most of that carbon in lieu of something like a parking lot. So there is an avoided conversion opportunity there if you leave that forest standing to sequester that carbon and monetize that in the marketplace. One of the considerations you have to contemplate here, and this is what we talk about when we're trying to make a differentiation between afforestation and something like improved forest management. Afforestation is called ex-ante accounting, where you're actually, you know, planting something today where you're going to accrue a carbon value over, say, a 100-year period. In the voluntary market, you are able to monetize that, you know, perhaps 100-year span today without naturally sequestering all that carbon today, because you're planting a seedling and that seedling is going to grow over 100 years, and over 100 years you might sequester 10 tons of carbon, but you may be able to pre-sell that carbon today to a voluntary buyer. That won't play in a compliant market space. In a compliant market space, the carbon has to be ex post, which means after the fact, which means that carbon already has to have been sequestered. So as we look at some of these graphs I'm about to get into, we'll explain that a little bit further. If you look at the afforestation, reforestation graph, our baseline there in blue is what that piece of land would have looked like in the absence of a restoration project. Now at year 0, what we're going to start doing is planting seedlings, and over time, over 100 years, those seedlings are going to capture carbon, they're going to grow, and at 100 years, you see there we're going to have a whole whack of carbon. Now, again, if you look at from a monetary perspective, all of the costs, if you have to overlay a graph on that, all of the costs would be in year 1 or 2 where you're actually doing the project, and you can see your ability to monetize that happens incrementally over time. So if you were actually to sell that carbon ex post, you would sell only the increments on a year-by-year basis. So year 1, how much carbon do you have? Not much. year 50, if you look at where it says time, say that's year 50, you have some carbon to sell, but not a ton. Year 100, you have a whole whack of carbon to sell. So you have to be patient to get your return on investment there. Or what you do is monetize that ex ante and get a voluntary buyer to buy that up front. Improved forest management. The bottom blue baseline there is, let's say we have a normal cut and grow operating paradigm where every, say, 20 years you cut and then it regrows and then you cut and then it regrows and then you cut and it regrows, and that's the jagged line there. You average it with the dashed line and there's your baseline. Now I may come in and acquire that property and choose not to do that type of scenario. I may choose to let it grow up to, say, year 30 or 40, then I'm going to do some you know, trimming here and there, and maybe instead of doing, say, 50,000 cubic meters, I'm going to do 10,000 or 20,000 cubic meters, and I'm going to change that baseline. So it's going to be a more conservation baseline as opposed to a cut and grow baseline like you see there. So I'm able, under an improved forest management protocol, to actually take that carbon, that delta between what that baseline would have been and what it is under the project scenario, and monetize that incrementally ex post over 100 years. So you can see it's not quite as big as an ex ante reforestation project at 100 years, but it allows you to still finance and maybe make up the difference between what you would have done in a normal harvesting scenario. Avoided conversion, this is taking an otherwise healthy forest, perhaps, and chopping it down and making a parking lot. So as you can see, under that baseline, you would have lost all of that carbon right off the bat the first couple of years once it's cleared. But under the project baseline, that carbon is still there, still sequestering. So you're able to make a claim on that. Now, these are very general, you know, make no mistake, they're very general, but it gives you a basic idea of the types of projects that are available for you to do. So what are the standards right now? We talked about this just a bit earlier on. Under the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, there's 9 different forest methodologies available. These methodologies run the gamut from improved forest management and temperate and boreal rainforest, or temperate and boreal forests here in North America, and internationally for that matter, to very specific red type applications internationally, whether you're in Indonesia, Africa, or South America. It's been at the forefront of methodology development. What the VCS does is it allows you as a project developer or an organization to develop a methodology. It goes through a double validation process, which means that 2 different groups, validators, licensed, authorized validators, have to tear through it and certainly make changes and comments and criticize and whatnot before it actually receives full validation and it's fungible to be used for additional projects. So there are a number of different forestry applications around the world. So the great thing about VCS is it allows you to actually produce methodologies and protocols that apply to those circumstances. And as I said, there's 9 right now, and guaranteed you're going to see a few more coming down the pipeline as more projects are developed in specific bioclimatic regions. Climate Action Reserve down in California, statewide now, it has 2 forest protocols available, Forest Protocol 3.2, which looks at IFM, avoided conversion and restoration, and something called the Urban Forestry Protocol, which is urban restoration projects. Both of those are actually being adapted and adopted for use under AB 32 in California, which is this whole pre-compliance thing we were talking about. BC emissions trading, I'm going to talk about BC just because we're here and I know we're doing a lot of work on it. The Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, the final draft is supposed to come out shortly, and that deals with those same types of projects, but from a BC perspective. And it's quite frankly, I would think, something that could be used across Canada and could be adopted into WCI jurisdictions like Ontario and Quebec. Yet to be seen if that's going to happen, but it's something you have to consider when you're looking at projects, depending on how emissions trading goes here in Canada at the regional level. CCBA, also very popular for voluntary forestry. You don't technically have to use one of the other protocols. You could just do a project to CCBA and sell that as a highly charismatic project. Of course, in the marketplace, those do command different prices, but it's something that's been done before and it's been done successfully. ISO 14064-2, up until last year, Canada never really had a protocol or protocols to follow. That's why we see the development of FCOP. That's why we saw the adoption of VCS in Canada. We didn't meet our Kyoto obligations, So finally everybody decided to throw it in the bag.